Welcome, dear students, to the massive open online course on Political Economy 2. In our module today, we are going to discuss about the state in the third world. The basic objective of this module are as follows. We would like to discuss the rise of the state through the ages, and we would also try to understand what essentially the term third world implies. We would also look into the theoretical framework underlying the role of the state and what is the concept of an overdeveloped state. How does the state's decision-making process really works is another important thing that we are going to see here, and what is the role of the state according to the Schumpeterian approach. It is obvious that understanding the relationship between the state and the society has been one of the major concerns of political and economic scientists. In particular, the fundamental question that what should be the role of the state has occupied the center stage and the attention of many scholars throughout the years. For many scholars, the basic function of the state was to supply law, order, and to protect the property rights. In that sense, from the classical view, the state provides a framework of order on which the rest of the economy is built. Therefore, it has been said that the state has potentially the power to play a major role in facilitating the economic development due to incomplete markets, imperfect information, transaction cost, etc. Although we know that there is an important role of state in facilitating development and promoting institutional changes, there is no inevitably that the state will take the initiative nor that its policies will succeed. The state can fail like the market economy, not only if it does the wrong things, but sometimes also if it does too little or too much at the same time. So as Max Weber claimed, the state has the monopoly power over the legitimate use of coercion in a given region, so naturally it can impale a desirable institutional innovation. Now, if we try to analyze the role of the state in a classical economic theory, we can say that the most desirable state is one that is limited to the basic function of protection against force, theft, fraud, enforcement of contracts, etc. Basically, what we call the night watchman state. However, in practice, the state has extended its sphere of influence well beyond that of a minimal state. Besides the monopoly power of the state has also emphasized its role in relation to the currency and the business cycle. For example, by the 1950s, there was an acceptance of government intervention in the economy because of the Pigovian approach, which viewed the government's role to correct market failures and to overcome the negative externalities in order to achieve efficiency in the economy. In particular, after the Second World War, the Keynesian revolution in economic theory convinced the public that various forms of market failure was responsible for the Great Depression of the 1930s. The new Keynesian fiscal policies, the extension of public ownership, and an increase in a wide variety of reforms of state intervention were the main issues of the post-war period of the 1970s. So therefore, the Keynesian post-war welfare state became the culmination of a long period of increased state intervention. Now, let us try to understand what essentially the word third world means. The term third world refers to a group of countries with certain common features, and according to some writers, the developed capitalist countries constitute the first world. The socialist countries are called the second world, while the underdeveloped countries in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, they were subject to colonial domination, and they were those countries which were called the third world. Some scholars also categorize it in a different way. They categorize the superpowers as the first world. The other developed countries like the UK, Germany, Australia, Canada, they were clubbed together as a second world, while the third world consists of underdeveloped countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, when we try to analyze all the role of state in terms of a theoretical framework, basically the liberal framework dominates. The liberals basically argued that the state was a neutral agency and they act as an arbiter between the contending groups in the society. In other words, no group has a privileged access to the state. Different groups in the society make their demands on the political system. The state agencies consider all these demands and take decisions in the general interest of the society or the economy at large. And so we find that the state agencies are generally dominated by the elite groups. The elite groups exercise domination by virtue of certain personal characteristics which are not due to the control of any sort of economic resources that they have. The liberal theory holds that in a democracy, the elite groups do not use power in their personal or group interests. Electoral compulsions force them to work for the welfare of all groups. In the third world, the westernized elite controls the state and use it as an instrument to transform the traditional agrarian society into a modern industrial society. Of course, one major difficulty in attempting to isolate the economic role of the state from its political, social, and military role is that these roles are closely interdependent. So naturally, this point led Hayek and many other liberal economists to argue that an extension of state ownership or the forms of state involvement in the economy necessarily gives rise to a totalitarian, repressive political system. So we claim that although Hayek's contention is not completely true from the pluralistic viewpoint of developed countries, unfortunately, it often manifests itself in the LDCs, in the less developed countries of third world, with increasing state involvement resulting in a very, very repressive political setting. So we can criticize the liberals on this ground by saying that they refuse to recognize that political capacity of individuals is decided by their economic resources. And it also fails to explain how the elite groups work for the entire society, rising above their narrow and social interests. Next, we come to the Marxist framework. Now, Marx argues that the state expresses the interest of the dominant classes to protect their interest. So, hence, the nature of the state depends upon the character of the division of labor in the society. However, most of the writings deal with the developed capitalist countries, and these explanations are not valid for the third world, which are different from the capitalist countries. The third world do have a colonial past, which we should never forget. So even after securing political independence, these third world economies are subject to economic exploitation by the Western developed economies. Yet, another important attribute of the third world countries is that they are not dominated by any one single class, but rather they are dominated by multiple classes. The third world countries were subjected to colonial exploitation that disturbed their course of development and brought about a lopsided development in these economies. So the domination of the third world by imperialistic powers continued long after even they were decolonized. There is no unanimity among the scholars about the nature of relationship amongst the third world countries and the developed Western world. Now, some writers who propounded the dependency theory argue that the third world countries do not enjoy political freedom and continue to be dominated by the imperialist powers. critics of the dependency theory rejected the argument that the third world state has no autonomy. According to these writers, political freedom has enabled the third world countries to use the state to further their own interest within the constraints that were imposed by the neo-colonial dominations. The colonial rulers have created a highly centralized state machinery to maintain their domination over the colonized. The state machinery is thus imposed from above, and it has not evolved into out of these internal society dynamics. Hence, the third world state is not in tune with society. It is either advanced or overdeveloped when compared with the society at large. So here, I am tempted to introduce the concept of the role of state in developed versus the developing countries. Now, a group of political economists claim that the state and the role of the state in developing countries are very much different from the democratic Western societies. Amongst these economists, we can count Grindal, Mayer, Finlay, and Tulloch. Now, for Finlay, most of the developing countries today are ruled by military juntas or are one-party dictatorships, and that the state dominates the civil society. In the light of this specification, Finlay grouped the type of states in the third world countries as traditional monarchies, like we have in Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Jordan, etc. Traditional dictatorship, like in Cuba, Paraguay, Haiti, etc. Authoritarian states, like right-wing authoritarian states like Turkey, Egypt, Brazil, Argentina. And also we have the left-wing authoritarian states like China, Vietnam, North Korea, etc. And then, of course, we do have the democratic states like Sri Lanka, Venezuela, Costa Rica, India, for example. So he claimed that since in each of these developing countries, the state structure is very different from the developed countries, the technique of analysis must also be different. And Tulloch also pointed out that the majority of the people are ruled by autocracies as the dominant form of government in the world today. He observed that since 1914, on the whole, democracy has become a less significant form of government and dictatorship has become more and more important. He explained that since the most autocracies are in developing countries, the modified relationship between the new political economy and the developing countries is a necessity. I have once mentioned the word overdeveloped state. So what essentially do I mean by an overdeveloped state? Now, in the Western capitalist countries, the modern nation state has emerged due to the internal dynamics of the society. The rising capitalist class took the initiative to establish a nation state. In the third world, the motive force for change in the political institution basically comes from outside. So during the colonial period, the third world was dominated by the westernized capitalist countries. The colonial rulers had created political institutions in their own image to facilitate domination over the native classes and the economic exploitation of the colonies. To perform this function, the colonial rulers have related and elaborated legal institutional structures to control the colonies. The bureaucracy who manned these institutions, they play a vital role in managing the affairs of the colonial state, of the colonial rulers. So even after independence, the elaborate structure that the colonial rulers had made remains still in existence. So when we talk about this overdeveloped state, there are basically two salient features of this type of state. One, it is not formed by the local classes, nor is it established as a consequence of social change. And two, the native ruling classes has no control over the state. Now, it should be kept in mind that an overdeveloped state basically weakens the democratic institutions. So even in those third world countries where democratic institutions exist and the elective representatives control the state agencies, bureaucracy retains its domination over the state. However, it exercises control in league with the politicians. In countries having democratic control, politicians occupy central place. The politicians articulate the demands of the people to cultivate their support. They formulate policies to fulfill the demands of the people, and in this process, the politicians provide legitimacy to the political institutions. However, the power is hemmed by the bureaucratic procedures and the controls. So politicians basically are converted into brokers between the state and the people. So, what exactly is a state's decision-making process? There are four general approaches to explain the state's decision-making process in both the developed and the developing economies. The first approach, which is advocated by a wide range of social scientists, including the Marxists, they view the state as the agency of a particular group or classes. The state institutes the property rights that maximize the revenue of the ruling class, regardless of its impact on the wealth of the nation as a whole. The state also consists of a multitude of agents, politicians, technocrats, and bureaucrats. As accepted by the public choice theory, each agent, that is the agents, the politicians, the bureaucrats, they have their own interest, and the state is viewed as an instrument for achieving this type of collective action. Thus, the policies of the state are endogenously determined by the competing powers of the various interest groups. There is another approach that views a state as a personalized organic entity with its own values, own motivations, and objectives that are independent of the individuals of whom the state is composed of. So, as an integrated cell of the state, an individual loses his own identity since the state acts to maximize its own welfare or utility. And then there is another approach where they try to view the state as a single, from the point of view of a single political party or a set of political elite. The party basically is a multi-person team seeking to control the government apparatus but by legal means. Now, Schumpeter, in his earlier work, like The Crisis of the Tax State, he had observed that states came into existence only after public and private sectors had distinct roles in the society. For him, feudalism did not produce a state, since all the property rights were vested in the pension of the lord. So with the evolution of feudalism, property was divided into private and public titles. Then, as the property and the market system developed, the state activities and especially war had to be financed by the state. Thus, taxation of private activities and property became the chief form of revenue. Schumpeter claimed that the tax state, capitalism, and war were the elements in the same basic social change. In his later work, Schumpeter has observed that the extraction of tax revenue by the state has an enormous influence on the economic organization, social structure, human spirit and culture, and the fate of nations. So, in his work, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, Schumpeter raised the question whether capitalism as an economic system would have been able to survive, and he concluded that socialism eventually would replace capitalism also in the Western democracies. Even though he essentially reached the same conclusion as that of Marx, his arguments were entirely different. It was not the shortcoming or the instability of capitalism that had produced the victory of socialism. Rather, Schumpeter says that it was a superior performance of capitalism that paved the way for socialism. He saw the declining economic importance of the entrepreneur as one of the major forces in the transformation from capitalism to socialism. So, what should be the role of the state in developing countries? And to answer this question, we have selected two approaches, the Schumpeterian approach and the public choice approach. And we know that one approach would not be enough to answer this question from the context of the third world economies. So, essentially we need to have a blend of both the approaches. While the public choice scholars claimed that the distribution of resources produced by the market is socially optimal, hence the state should limit itself to the minimal state, because a market is capable of working efficiently if there is no form of state intervention. The minimum state is the best state. Therefore, to be able to achieve this optimum level, what they say that the state should be slimmed, privatizing welfare and restricting the government should be the policies pursued, and the public choice scholars' main solution is to limit all the developed and the developing countries to limit the government by constitution in order to control the central expenditure, revenue, debt, etc. So basically, they just talk about the minimalist state. While that solution, a small politic is also offered for better economics. By doing that, rent-seeking activities and corruption will be controlled and efficiency will be maintained. But in developing countries, as Finlay has repeatedly pointed out, that the state structure is very different from the developed countries, and the techniques of analysis should also be entirely different. So therefore, a more appropriate framework for studying the behavior of the state in the developing countries is the multi-level principal-agent framework. Grindal suggested that limiting the Leviathan solution is a very weak one to improve policy-making process in the developing economies. So Schumpeter's argument in this context will be more helpful, since he claimed that politics should not be viewed as a negative factor. Instead, it can be seen as the product of politicians, just like entrepreneurs sells their product in the market. It is the politicians are basically selling policies like their counterpart, the entrepreneurs in the economy. So for Schumpeter, the development of the capitalist economy itself undermines the entrepreneurial or innovative function which Schumpeter regards as the essential feature of capitalism, because technological progress and the bureaucratic administration of large enterprises tend to make innovation itself a routine matter. As we said, that an appropriate framework for analyzing in the third world economies would be to study the principal agent framework. Now, in almost all developing countries, the state tends to dominate the civil society, and they have a substantial degree of autonomy in policy making. Therefore, a more appropriate framework for studying the behavior of the state in the developing countries is basically a multi-level principal agent framework. At the first level, the head of the state or the ruler can be treated as the agent of the people or the ruling class. The ruler, king, dictator, president or prime minister is the ruling person who has a substantial degree of autonomy in pursuing his or her own legitimacy and the legal tradition of the society. At the second level of the principal agent problem, the ruler has to employ the bureaucrats as agents to assist him in implementing the law and the rules. Nevertheless, the bureaucrats are rational in the sense that their interest will never coincide with that of the ruler. Hence, they will use the authority that is delegated to them by the ruler, and the bureaucrats will maximize their own benefits. It is true that the discretionary behavior of the bureaucrats cannot be completely eliminated even in totalitarian states, and in many cases there is a collusion between the bureaucrats and the others who divide up the revenue of the state by bribe taking and rent seeking rather. So, the constraints on the ruler's decision making and the bureaucrats' discretion vary with the nature of the state, often becoming more restrictive as the nature of the state shifts from traditional monarchy to traditional dictatorship to authoritarian and ultimately to the democratic state. So, I would like to conclude this module by saying that the third world states are to a large extent colonial creations in the sense that their boundaries, the nature of their regimes, they have been deeply influenced by the colonial policies. The nature of the third world state is analyzed in liberal, democratic, Marxist and the new Marxist framework. The third world economies are integrated into the world economy, which is guided by the principles of free market and represent the interests of the dominant sections of the society. While, they are dependent on the former colonial power, they also exercise a certain degree of independence and mediate between the state and the metropolis. So the third world state is desired as basically a overdeveloped state rather than a state which is having relative autonomy, or rather as a dependent state.